let's introduce our first speaker of the day, which is Peter Thomas.
Hey, thanks you for the intro. Hello, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to attend the session. I'm Peter. I work for Intuit, and around 3 years back, I actually created this open source project called Karate, which I'm going to talk about. It's all about test automation. I shall try to do some demos. You'll get a feel of what the syntax looks like and what it can do. And yeah, it started as a side project, but as I would hopefully demonstrate, it has seen some pretty good adoption. There are a lot of companies using it all around the world. I'll give you some data points of adoption. And you know, I think the takeaway from this session is to try it out. I think it's worth evaluating for various reasons, and hopefully, I can give you a glimpse of how it can fit into your testing strategy. So yeah, a little bit of background. This is how Karate started as an open source project. What happened was I was actually working with my team's automation suites, and it was a kind of a homegrown framework, which is quite common. And I felt things could be done better, and one thing led to another, and then Karate came about. So we call it a DSL. It stands for domain specific language. And I'll try to give you some examples as to why we call it a domain specific language. In terms of popularity, it's got 4,000, it's touching 4,000 stars on GitHub, which is quite impressive considering that this project is relatively young. And what you should take away from this session is these capabilities of Karate that I have listed on the right. They are kind of impressive. In fact, it may look too good to be true. Is it really possible for one single automation framework or tool to actually do all these things at the same time? Hopefully I can convince you of that by the end of this presentation. So that's one reason why Karate is, I think, popular, because it's, people find it useful. Some teams use it only for API testing. Some use it for mocking, which is very, very important, especially in this era of microservices. And here on the slide is one example, one data point of Karate being recognized by the experts and the community. ThoughtWorks actually 2 years in succession actually listed it in their Tech Radar. It's actually this is a renowned document that they release every quarter. A lot of tech leaders actually use this as a reference. So Karate being there and now going up in rating, hopefully by next year we'll be in the middle of that, the circles and the targets and all that. So looking forward to that. And yeah, before I get into the main content of the session, I just wanted to call this out. In fact, I put the slide in after seeing Seb Rose's presentation yesterday. I think all of you would remember the cucumber presentation from SmartPair, and the term BDD, right? Yes, it's been misunderstood. People misuse BDD in situations. People feel that they are doing BDD, but they haven't. So if you're interested in that aspect and what I have to say about that, do look up this article. It should be easy to find on the internets. But what I want to say right now at this point in the presentation is that Karate, although it would look suspiciously like cucumber with the given, when, then pattern of keywords, is not to be looked at as a pure BDD testing framework. It is very much a programming tool or a syntax, but it tries to keep things simple, which I will show you in a moment. And most importantly, it assumes that you are writing the tests after your code for your actual system is in place, as opposed to BDD, where you already know that BDD should start in the discovery phase, even before a single line of code has been written. So with that out of the way, let me take a couple of minutes to just give some context. Why are microservices, or where do microservices fit in the architectures of today? And a little bit of context. I've been around in the industry for a long time, and some of you would remember everything started out with plain old web pages. You click a link and the entire page would refresh. Some of you may be old, have been around since the eras of CGI bin and things like that, if that rings a bell. And everything changed when Google, for example, came up with Google Maps, and people started getting used to these dynamic experiences. And the key word here is Ajax, right? You click on a web page, and you start seeing very rich interactive responses where only sections of the page would refresh, right? And today, this is taken for granted. In fact, today we are in an extreme stage, and all of you would have heard the term single page application, SPA, right? So you just load this one page, and then everything else from that point onwards is just refreshing of different widgets or areas of your web page. And behind the scenes, again, this in the old days when everything started, your browser would make this one HTTP request. You would type in an address in the address bar. It goes to the server and it returns HTML. And some of you would remember the MVC architecture on the server. Think JSP, think ASPs, and all that. Things are very different now with JavaScript. In this way, so what I've just built on the slide is that we now expect a lot of JavaScript on your front end. And these are all the experiences that you can think of today, your shopping cart, your Amazon, YouTube, whatever. But what's happening behind the scenes is that we have a bunch of services, typically REST services with JSON as the data format. And now this blob of JavaScript makes a request. And instead of HTML, you are getting pure data back in the form of JSON. And that's how things kind of work today, right? And where does Karate fit in this picture? Let's focus on the services, and Karate sits here, and it's headless, right? There's no UI, which is one of the characteristics of API testing. Karate makes requests pretending to be a browser or whichever other technology is your client, and you get back JSON, and Karate does all the assertions and checks that you would expect when you're doing testing, okay? With that, let's get into code a little bit. This that you're seeing right now on the slide is an example of Karate. This is a hello world example. And yes, on the left-hand side, it would strike those who are familiar with BDD and Cucumber. Yes, that's given, when, then happening there. And as I said earlier, they are there only for cosmetic reasons. In fact, watch out for the examples that I would be showing later in this presentation. You would see in many cases, we just remove, we don't even use given, when, then, and we kind of shorten it to an asterisk symbol or a star symbol, and that's perfectly fine. When you don't need the kind of the decoration aspect of given, when, then, which is all it's doing here in Karate, you can do without it. Now, why has Karate, Karate is designed for API testing and JSON specifically. And I talked about JSON, and JSON is kind of the data backbone of the internet in a sense. And JSON is natively handled by Karate. You can express JSON like this. You can see a curly brace. You can see pure data, which is all plain text. And if you are familiar with programming languages like Java or .NET, for example, you would maybe recall that it's a little sludgy. You'll probably have to escape backslash, using a backslash character and double quotes. But what you see here is very elegant. It's exactly how JavaScript programmers deal with JSON on a daily basis. And keep in mind that JSON, the JS stands for JavaScript, so it's kind of made for JavaScript. And this is one of the nice things about Karate. And I talked about the DSL aspect. And I would like to call your attention to the second word on each line of this code. I'll start with URL, request, method, status, and here below there is path. And these terms, URL, request, method, status, path, they make total sense to anyone who's in the business of HTTP or REST and web services. And there you see, that's why Karate is called DSL. It's a domain-specific language. You just express, I want to do a post, and it does a post with the minimum of syntax and noise and typing. And This to me is one of the big deals about Karate, and we are all in the business of testing or checking or validating the responses that you get back from the server. And what you see here happen is in one step, we can assert that every single data element that came back from the server is as expected. And you can see there's something interesting happening here with this ID data value. We have this thing hash, we have hash not null. And what it's doing is that it's doing a fuzzy kind of match. It's not checking for an exact value. It's just looking for a format or a data type, as you would see in future examples. This is a big deal because in the world of HTTP and JSON and web services, a lot of the time, the things or the data that you get back from the server are unpredictable. These are random values like date stamps or UUIDs. So this is super useful in those situations, right? Where you can't predict, but you do want to validate that something came back, and maybe it's a string that came back or a number. And you can do all these things in Karate. And finally, you never test one API in isolation. You always would orchestrate this test that you're looking at, even though it's a simple example, is actually making two calls, right? It made a post in the fourth line, and then at the second last line, it does another call, which is a get. And you can see that we reused the data, which happens to be in this response variable. We were able to extract data from what came back from the server, plug it into the next request, and go on. And you can do this as much as you want. You can chain requests. Karate is really good at that. Typically in your situations, if you were into testing, if you get into testing with API testing of any form, you would invariably be making some kind of an SSO single sign-on call, getting some token, authentication token, then using that in all your tests. And maybe this is a good time to do a demo. And okay. Yes, I saw a question from Alan, and I can take that right now. We do support regexes. There's a whole bunch that there's a slide that's going to skim through all the possibilities. You should be able to see my ID right now. And here is another point that I would like to call out, which is I think one of Karate's selling points. You don't need to be a great programmer to use Karate. It's actually designed to be very simple. It kind of steals some concepts from BDD and Gherkin, which you already heard about yesterday, to make it a little readable and more, what do you say, easy on the eyes in a sense. But finally, with a minimum of fuss and very simple keywords, like it said, URL request method, you can express requests. This is an actual test. And by the way, what you're looking at, if you have a question as to what is this ID, it's Visual Studio Code. We actually have first-class support. This has been contributed by a gentleman who I never have met called Kirk. And he's written a plugin. So this is an example of the magic that happens in open source. Contributions just coming from totally unexpected places, and they are awesome. So we have first-class support for Karate, and what that means is, if I go back to this example, which should be very simple, we are going to make a post to this URL. And because of the IDE support, I can actually click here. I know you have these very helpful things called code lenses. That's what they call this in the Visual Studio Code world. I can click on this directly, and it's just going to kick off the test. I didn't need to, compile anything or get on the command line. You can do things on the command line, but we have just executed a test. And one of the selling points of Karate, it has pretty good reports, by the way. I'm going to open the report from the log. And one of Karate's selling points, which not many API testing tools do, is that you get the logs of the HTTP traffic, the request and response, in line with your tests report. And I'll show you more examples of reports and what happens when you get an error, because I think that's really important, right? A good testing framework should actually make it easy for you to troubleshoot a problem that you'll invariably have when you're testing stuff. Great. So with that demo out of the way, I'm going to spend some time on some code for a moment. So The reason I'm doing this is because I just want to show the difference between Karate and other tools. One of the famous uh, options for Java programmers, especially, is REST assured, and you'll see some of the differences in the way that Karate approaches JSON here. I already talked a lot about JSON. JSON to me is a super elegant data format. I can go on talking about JSON, especially after this last 3 years working with it in the context of Karate. I'm a big fan. What you see on the right is JSON, right? It's so elegant. You have name, kittens, and here's a tip. With the moment you see a square bracket, it's an array, and the moment you see a curly brace, it's an object. And yes, on the left, this is the equivalent of all that JSON when you write a Java class. Yes, no surprises here. Java is not known to be the most concise of languages. And we're not done yet, actually. We still have to instantiate the class using the new keyword and call all those setters. And only then would you arrive at this beautiful, elegant representation of data on the right. Okay, so let's get into testing. And what I've just built on the screen is actually a valid snippet of Karate, and it's a Karate assertion. And it's saying the kittens property within this object. And yeah, we have variables. We defined a variable called Billy. So does Billy.kittens contains, because it's an array of kittens, right? You see the square bracket, and it's an array of objects. And we're doing in this assertion. And this, if you are into Java or .NET or C#, you would probably realize it's not a very straightforward assertion to write or express in Java code. This is a very, this is not so nice, this code example, because I've hard coded 42 and wild over here. I'll make this more enterprisey and elegantly, nicely take cat and kitten as arguments. So this is like general purpose and reusable and all that. But you can still see, right, Java, because Java, you have to check for nulls, you have to iterate over collections, and I'm pretty sure there's still bugs in this code. You don't have all this complexity with Karate, and it can get even better. I'm giving you another example here where we are saying that we are asking a question, does that array of kittens contain any kitten where the name is a string and where the ID is greater than 25. So that is a pretty interesting assertion, and it works just as you would expect here. And I'm not even going to attempt to derive the Java code for this because it's going to be super complicated. So that's one of the reasons why Karate, I think, there's a lot of thought and a lot of effort that's gone into Karate for assertions. And I think it's come out really well. So someone asked a question on regexes. You see that on the fourth and the second last line on the left. These are all the macros or the hash kind of magic incantations that you have as part of the Karate syntax. And I'll show some examples. These two lines that I've just built on the slide are normal JavaScript kind of expressions, right? In the world of JavaScript, if you have a reference to an object like cat, you can say cat dot this, and square brackets are, as you would probably know, are ways to access arrays or by index. But things get interesting with Karate because we also support the star kind of a syntax, and this is something called JSON path. And what is JSON path? I think a lot of you know what XPath is. JSON path is like XPath for JSON. And if you do not know what XPath is, the best way to explain JSON path, it is like SQL for JSON. So imagine that you had this humongous big JSON that came back from somewhere, and you want to just query on it and say, I just want to find only the IDs of kittens within this big blob. And that's what you're kind of doing in this example. And we have a contains keyword, and this is super useful because again, in the world of, I talked about unpredictable values, but the very common situation in the world of APIs is that the order of arrays that come back from your server cannot be predicted. So the contains keyword does not care about the order of the elements. There is something like this double dot. Again, if you know XPath, is exactly like the double slash, where you can kind of traverse the entire depth of a complicated tree structure that may exist. Again, super useful, right? Number, just like you have string. And by the way, I always love to call this out in my presentation, where one of the nice things about JSON is there are only 3 primitive data types: string, number, and Boolean. That's it. There's no date type, which kind of keeps things simple. And I have a feeling that this is one of the reasons why REST won over SOAP and all that, but that's another story. And that's the regex example right there. Super useful, as you can imagine, in many situations. And these last 2 lines that I'm going to build are very interesting, because we have, what you're looking at right now, the last line is a JavaScript function. So Karate has this secret ingredient, a secret sauce that's a JavaScript interpreter built into the whole thing. And I think this is one of the reasons why Karate has really, what do you say, become popular in a sense. It can handle all these crazy situations that you don't, that'll be really difficult to do in other kind of frameworks or competing frameworks. So the last line on the slide is actually doing a check. It's reusing that function is less than 50 to do an assertion, and doing that contains kind of a match that I talked about. What this means is that if you have complicated business logic or rules that you want to keep in this one common utility kind of a feature file or code and reuse this all across your suite, you can. Karate is all about reuse if you really get into the details. And yeah, this is some of the last bits of code I'm going to show you in this section of the presentation. But the reason I'm showing you this is many times when you come across this new framework or homegrown framework that tries to do something clever with keywords, which is what Karate kind of does, you will invariably hit a situation where the keywords don't fit, or you're trying to do something so complicated that you need some heavy lifting. The point of this slide is that it's very easy from Karate, because Karate runs in the JVM, or it's kind of a Java-based tool, that it's very easy for you from within a Karate script to call into the JDK or JVM, run some custom code, or reuse any JDK class. For example, in this, what you're looking here, com.include, this dbutils is actually a custom bit of code that I wrote. It happens to be on the class path, which is normal for Java code. And what dbutils does, as you might have guessed from the name, is it can talk to RDBMSs. It can talk to, let's say, MySQL or whatever, right? And what we're doing, the first 2 lines, or that second line specifically, that's all the work you need to do in Karate to actually load a Java class and start using it. In fact, we went to the extent of actually we're constructing this Java class on the 3rd line. And this is super awesome. What this means is you can actually do things like this. Provided you wrote the heavy lifting in that dbutils class to do a SQL query, you can actually express SQL from a test, make database calls, get results back. There's one more very interesting thing that happens. If the data returned by your Java code is a hash map or a list of hash maps, hash map is dictionary in other programming languages, guess what it becomes? It becomes JSON, which is super cool. So basically, when things go from Karate into Java, it becomes a hash map, and comes back, it becomes JSON. And I've already hopefully made the case that Karate is all about asserting and manipulating JSON. And what we have done, and you see that last line, what we have done in this very crisp example is that we established an RDBMS database connection. We fired a SQL query, we iterated over all the results, and we actually checked whether one of the rows that came back was having an ID that we expected, because that ID was probably assumed that it was set up somewhere ahead of this code. Maybe we made a request that actually did an API call to do a post. All right, so I can quickly show you what executing a large Karate suite looks like. And one of the selling points of Karate is that it does parallel execution really well. You know what, parallel execution is something that most tools don't do well. Oops, that was a wrong example, so I'm going to kill that. Let me run this guy. Yeah, so we're starting a server, but don't worry about that service just to start a bunch of fake web services on localhost, which we are going to use for testing. It actually fires a lot of tests. And yes, I need to get used to scrolling around when the zoom toolbars are in the way. Pardon me on that. So that's a lot of tests, but we actually ran them on 5 threads. So it actually took a lot less time than it would have otherwise. Let me show you the reports very quickly. And interestingly, because Karate kind of started out as kind of a extension of Cucumber, we still support the proper pseudo standard, which is the Cucumber JSON format, which means we have access to this ecosystem of third-party reports, one example of which you're looking at right now. And this is no fun to see only green. So let me show you what happens if I introduce a deliberate error into one of my tests and I rerun this. Right? Because I'm sure none of us are fortunate enough to see a green build day in and day out. Tell me about it. So yes, something failed. And if I go back to the features, if I refresh this, if I can figure out how to refresh. Yes, we have one error. If you scroll down, you will very quickly be able to drill down and see it's this test that failed over here. Karate is rather good at actually telling you what failed with descriptive messages and so on. And if you wanted to, you could actually see the HTTP request and response that happened before things failed. Okay, so I'll just give you a flavor of Karate and parallel execution. The next demo and the next aspect of Karate, which I think is super interesting, and I call this one of my best hacks, and performance testing. Haven't you always wondered why you have this perfectly good set of regression tests that exist, all your lovely flows and business scenarios and user flows, and then maybe 2 weeks before production, there's a panic around you where someone says we need to do performance testing and we don't have time, and you need to call in the specialist SWAT team, experts who use JMeter or Gatling or Locust or whatever. You have to rewrite your flows in yet another tool, execute that, get a totally different set of reports, and then only would you have confidence and you would have done performance testing. But what if, and this is what Karate does actually, what if you could reuse your functional tests as performance tests? And Karate has a very interesting capability where you can take your tests, just add a load model, and the load model is nothing but your multiplication factor. You want to take a user sign in and multiply it by 100 or 1,000 or a million, whatever, and you get the reports. And let me show you how this looks like in practice. And one of the things that I'm going to show you along with this demo is, examples Gatling. And this project that I'm showing you is actually very interesting because it uses Karate mocks. Since I don't have a lot of time, I'm not going to explain mocks in detail, but just keep in mind that there is a mock in the picture. So this demo that I'm running would actually work even if my network was completely disconnected on my laptop. So Karate can simulate, Karate can not just make requests, it can simulate requests, which is very interesting in some situations. And keep in mind that one of the things the mock is going to do is that for one particular API method, which happens to be a delete, it's going to add an artificial delay of 850 milliseconds. I'm typing in stuff at the bottom of the screen. I'm going to just run a Maven test. So another takeaway is that Karate will work on the command line, which is very important for you to integrate Karate into your CI/CD. Karate is just like JUnit. It's got the same kind of reports, so it should fit into wherever we have Jenkins or things like that. We just ran a performance test that ran rather quickly. I'm opening the report, and one of the best things about Gatling is the quality of the reports. It's it's truly designed by experts, and as I said, the delete operation here is taking 800 milliseconds. So this is just scratching the surface of what is possible. In this case, we simulated a delay or a slow response, but you could respond with random errors and things like that. One of the other nice features about the Karate Gatling integration is that if there's an error, and we actually had a couple of errors deliberately set up in our flow, if you have errors, they would show up in the Gatling report, but with the Karate line number that failed. So that is a pretty good tight integration, which is obviously good. And yeah, I'll just skim through the reports. They are awesome. And yeah, Gatling is super. It's got a really good reputation of the reports. So that was about performance testing. And before I get into the last part of the presentation, a little recap. We started out by talking about Karate for API testing. I'll not go through all these boxes in detail. I think they are kind of self-explanatory. 1 year later, we added mocks. So I talked a little bit about mocks. You got a flavor of the mock and what the mock can do. In the case that we just showed you, you can simulate a slow response. And you saw the Gatling integration, one of my favorite hacks, as I said. And what's very interesting is as of like early this year, and we were running in a kind of a beta phase last year, we are doing UI testing. So I'm going to show you demos of that. And this is very interesting because Karate started out as an API testing tool, and we've now added. And yes, if you're thinking Selenium, Karate is competing with Selenium and all the other usual suspects that you can think of. And one of the things we do uniquely is that we not only support Chrome directly. When I say Chrome directly, a lot of you may have heard of Puppeteer, which is a very popular way of automating Chrome. But we can take the same test and using a config change, switch it to WebDriver. And I think a lot of you know that WebDriver is simply the specification, the W3C specification on which Selenium is based today. There's one more interesting thing. I don't have demos for this, but I'm calling this out because in case there's some of you in the audience who need to do Windows desktop application testing, this is something we have introduced really recently. I would love for you to check it out and give me feedback and reach out and post issues and all that. But I'm quite excited about this because it's just taking Karate into some very interesting dimensions, and who knows what's going to happen in the future. So let me show you a demo of Karate for UI testing, right? Again, it's Visual Studio Code. And in case I did not make this clear, right, I talked about Visual Studio Code and Karate being very easy to use for people who are non-programmers. And this entire experience you can get, in fact, it's probably worth me going and showing you the zip release. Look out for this if you're trying out Karate and you don't really have a background in Java programming or any kind of programming. There's something called the zip release, and you can literally get up and running with Karate in 5 minutes because you just extract a zip. The only prerequisite is that you need a Java runtime, not the full-fledged development kit. And you will be able to do all these demos that I'm showing you right now in 5 minutes. They will just run out of the box. And let me run this test. This test is very simple. It's just going to go to GitHub, attempt to log in with an ID that does not exist. You get an error message. It's happening very fast, I know. And I'm going to slow it down in a moment. And then it does a Google search for Karate. DSL lands on the Karate homepage and then validates that we did land on the right page, which is over here, right? Very simple. But what I'm about to show you is one of, I think, the most interesting capabilities of the whole Karate tooling, which is debug. So I'm going to click this debug link at the top. And pay attention, there's this red dot here. And when I've hovered my mouse over it, Visual Studio is helpfully saying that it's a breakpoint. So it started the test, but this time it's actually stopped at the breakpoint. And you probably know what's about to happen, right? We are actually going to step through a UI automation test. This is super important, right? And it's, in fact, of all the kinds of testing that you need debuggability for, it's UI automation. UI automation, trust me on this. I know all of you have been there. It's one of the hardest things to do, to be very honest. extremely painful, flaky tests, and so on. And yeah, and here's the interesting part. You can actually go, I'm sorry. So while we have stopped time in this case, you can actually bring up the, the browser tools, the developer tools, and actually introspect things on the page. But what I'm going to show you now is very interesting because you can actually go back in time. I'm going to click this button which says step back. And I can actually start replaying a test. And before doing that, let me edit this. Earlier, what was typed into this text box here, you saw it's test 1, 2, 3. I'm going to change this to, let's say, dummy. I hit this button, which is going to force a hot reload of the code. And if I now replay things and step through that line, you can see that we have actually, on the fly, without having to restart everything, made a change in our test. This is, I know a lot of you are sitting up quite excited because yes, this is pretty cool stuff. This is one of the dreams of an automation engineer where you're forever trying to fix something at the last line of your script and you need to repeat your whole login and authentication that might be time consuming, and this kind of solves that. So it's a nice thing. There are other things you can do like highlight. I'm actually typing in an interactive command. Watch the bottom of the screen. And there you go. You can actually play around with the screen, type in commands, see what works, and then edit your test, or at least build the components of your test in this interactive fashion. All right, so that was UI test automation. And the last part, I'm going to leave you with some possibilities, and there's no time to actually show you all this stuff in action. I'll try to do this one last demo, but now that you know that Karate, and the reason that I titled this presentation full stack, right? You all know this is a browser with the blob of JavaScript that makes calls to services. So this is a normal web page, right? And you add Karate into the mix. What Karate can do, and which I've just demoed, is that you can actually run a UI test. But Karate, keep in mind, is an API testing tool at its heart, which means that Karate can make API calls to the same service that the browser is making calls to. And what this means is that, to give you one use case, you can actually do a sign-in call using Karate, just using the API in a headless mode. And this is a huge time saver. So you can pick up an authentication token, and then you can take that token, plug it into your page, drop cookies basically, and you can bypass your login, the time consuming enter username, password, and all that. And that is part one. And the other interesting thing is that you can use Karate mocks to actually intercept requests that the browser makes. And this sets you up for all kinds of interesting tests. Like you can actually start doing component testing on your UI, which is very, very hard to do, in the old days, but Karate makes these options actually tantalizingly closer than you could expect. And obviously, Karate API test and UI test can coexist in the same flow, in the same script, which is a very interesting thing. So if I show you one last demo, I think I have about 8 minutes, and Costa, feel free to jump in and keep me honest on time. The demo that I wanted to show you is, yeah, I don't need the Gatling example anymore. Let me show you this example. This example, and to make it clear what's about to happen, is I'm going to open this URL directly in a web page to show you what it's supposed to look like. Okay, so so I wasn't expecting that. The site that I was intending to use for my demo is down. Who would have thought? seleniumeasy.com. So the demo that I had planned was to actually show you how a particular part of the page would have been stubbed out because the test was intercepting what the browser was doing. So the browser is attempting to, let's say, get an image from somewhere on the internet. We were able to intercept that call and return a fake image, which is residing on the local, locally on our file system on localhost. So sadly, I won't be able to do that demo. So I shall just skip through to the
We had a quick question. We had a quick question, Peter.
Yeah, sure.
And so the question is from Suchil. Suchil asks, are there any limitations on the number of calls we can make in one scenario and variables that we can use within that scenario?
Actually, no, there are none. In fact, if you're familiar with Cucumber, right, you even have these examples. Let me just remember an example to bring up. Let's look at outline. Yeah, by the way, you can even plug in CSV files. For those of you who know Cucumber a lot, you would probably know what a scenario outline is. It's basically a way to do quick data-driven testing. And the data-driven tests can be very human readable, even by non-technical people. So these are the nice things that we've kind of stolen from Cucumber. So if the question is how many of these data elements you can have, it's pretty much depending on the CPU and memory that you have, obviously. And in a single scenario, in this case, obviously, the scenario outline would multiply by the number of rows. And we can even take CSV files and all that. And I've seen people use CSV files as large as 10,000 and all. That's kind of ridiculous. At that point, you probably start running into log issues because the amount of logging that Karate does, you probably need to suppress it in order to still go ahead with that kind of testing. So answer is yes, hopefully. Hope that answered the question. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Peter. Yeah, I appreciate it. There was another question that came in asking, Ramesh asks, can you talk about the roadmap of Karate API testing and that feature and the architecture?
Yes. Well, if you're talking about this, I just want to quickly bring up the whole thing. Yeah, feel free to take a screenshot and look at this later and ask me questions offline. But the point is that Karate started out as an API testing tool, but very interestingly, started accumulating more and more capabilities that are very important for test automation. And hopefully that last example, and unfortunately I couldn't show you that last example, right? And in fact, let me check if by some miracle that page is up again. Okay, great. So let's do this demo, right? This demo is where you want to say Karate being able to fake a browser request and replace it with data that we're going to fake. So this is how the website actually behaves in practice, right? Every time you click this button, you get a new face, and all this is coming from some public database of pictures. So let me get that out of the way, and I'm going to run this test. Yeah, this test. And this test is actually setting up two things. One is to intercept this URL and to actually give full control to a particular mock file, which is this mock. And if I run this, yeah, okay. If I now click this button, Karate is actually going to fake it with this picture. And that picture is actually over here, right? It's on my local file system. And every time I hit that button, it's going to come back with that same picture because that's how we programmed the mock. But interestingly, the mock is able to keep track of state, which is just for the sake of demo. I'm incrementing a particular counter variable. So that was the demo. I'm thankful I was able to show you at the last minute. So the point here I'm trying to make is that because Karate has now got this super combination of mocks, API testing, and UI testing, it's able to do these things. There are not too many tools. We're not the only one that can do browser interception, but it's certainly something that is going to be a very useful part of your test strategy. And in terms of roadmap, you can take a look at this slide again. I won't go through all the aspects, but the point here on the slide is that, yeah, and you can see Karate started out here on the right. I'm sure all of you have heard of the test pyramid. And Karate started out in the bang middle of the test pyramid for API testing. And what's happened is it's started to do all these other things. And here's the interesting part about the slide. All the boxes in blue are things that Karate does today. These are things that actually are part of the Karate framework. So it does a lot. And again, it may be surprising that Karate has been able to, to get this far. Definitely when I started Karate, I never imagined it to do all these things. But I think, there's been a fair amount of, a good reception, people using it. good feedback and all that. And I'm going to leave you all with this last slide. And as I said at the start of this presentation, right, some of what karate does today is maybe too good to be true. So my only ask is do evaluate it. And certainly there will be problems that you may find, but we are very responsive. Stack Overflow is a place where you can certainly hope to get a very quick response if you have questions. In fact, day before, I saw someone actually release a Udemy course on karate. So that's one indication of the adoption and the momentum that we have. This picture, I think all the old timers in the audience may recognize. It was a meme before the word meme was a thing. I think it goes back to 2004 or something.
We have a few more things that came in.
Yep.
So Prashant, it's not a question. He just gives a testimony that they started using karate about 6 to 8 months ago, and it's been super easy to write tests for less automation skilled team members. So that's good, good feedback. He says we use it for API, web UI, and performance testing. So thanks, Prashant, for sharing that.
What if karate can truly, be the one-stop shop for all the aspects that you see on the left? You've heard about all these tools over the many years that you've been in test automation. We are trying, to do something different. It's very ambitious, but so far it looks good. And you can be the judge. Do evaluate karate and see how it works for you. There are some parts of karate which are very opinionated. I'm probably the reason for all of that. But there should be some good things that you can find, and I hope you have a good experience with it. And yeah,
awesome.
Go ahead, Costa, all yours.
Thank you so much, Peter. Yes, this is all wonderful. Yeah, so we have two questions. The first one is from Manish. He asks, he says, this is exciting. Do you plan to build in contract-based testing for APIs?
Great question. And the answer is very interesting. And again, I don't have time for this. There is a particular YouTube video of mine you can look up. But I do have some backup slides that I had prepared, so I can show you this. I'm not going to talk through that slide, all of it. If I talk through this, it's going to take 10 minutes. But your takeaway is this: karate in its current form can do contract-driven, consumer-driven contract testing. It's not such a big deal. In fact, I have this somewhat biased, and I have this opinion that maybe the way that contract testing is approached by some of the other tools, I think it's a little more over-engineered than it needs to be. So feel free to look this up. There's a whole bunch of documentation on karate's particular approach to contract-driven testing. There's even an example that you should be able to find very quickly. You can see that I'm already diving into it. It's consumer-driven contracts. And you have the companion documentation, which is part of the karate README, right here. So answer is yes, do check it out. I don't have time to explain all of it now, unfortunately, but trust me, it works. Yeah.
Wonderful. We have one final question from Bharat. He asks, does the tool have integration support with APM tools like New Relic and Splunk?
Great question. The short answer is no, not directly, but you can write it. In fact, this reminds me, the question we get a lot is that we want to integrate with Report Portal and all these third-party reporting solutions. And the way that we recommend that you do this is that karate has a concept of an execution hook. So there are some callbacks. You have to write a little bit of Java code, but if you can write a little bit of Java code, we have all these extension points that you can use to do all these custom integrations. That said, let's see if I can bring up, the other part of my answer is that already within karate, for example, if you're doing a WebDriver test that's similar to Selenium, if you switch on detailed logging, you would actually see the wire protocol and all the HTTP requests that karate makes to the the grid or the WebDriver executable. You would see all those requests and responses in line with your test script, which is just excellent for traceability and debuggability and so on. So that's the other thing I just wanted to call out. So short answer is no direct support for things like Splunk and APM, but it should be just a little bit of Java code away in a custom way.
Wonderful. Did you want to have any final thoughts you wanted to share with us as we close out?
No, this was awesome. Thanks, Costa, for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to speak. It's just great to connect with test automation enthusiasts of any form. I think I had a good time, and I love the question. So that's all. Feel free to reach out. Obviously, I would be on the Slack if you have some specific questions. And I wish all of you all the best in your test automation efforts. Everyone, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much again, Peter. We appreciate your time. This was an awesome session, very insightful and interesting.